Hello. Hi there. What is going on? Welcome back to another exciting evening of Roar Stream. If you are joining us live tonight, thank you for coming in. I know there's a lot of awesome content on the internet. There is so much out there. I think this is a little loud. Let me turn this down just a tiny bit. There we go. Let me know about the audio. I know there's lots of fun, exciting things on the internet for you to have on your second monitors or to check out on YouTube in the future. But if you came here, I love you. I'm gonna ring a bell just to show you how much I love you. That much. One bell's worth. And there may be more bells coming in the future, but for now it's just one. But I have faith. There'll be more. Tonight, I was planning on playing a different thing. I was planning on finishing up Boyfriend Dungeon, 100%ing it. That that changed suddenly. The filing today on August 1st is for the third indictment of former President Donald J. Trump. And once again, we are going to be taking a look at the old indictment from Special Counsel Jack Smith. If you are unfamiliar or you need a reminder of some of the fun facts of the court cases, I have a little bit of a little refresher. I don't have this up on screen, so you're going to have to trust me. So Donald Trump has been indicted federally and charged with election fraud, potentially the most serious criminal charges he faces in all three of the cases. Previously, though, he was first indicted in March of 2023 by the Manhattan District Attorney on state charges related to hush money payments in 2016 with Stormy Daniels. God bless her. She is just a national legend. Trump's next court date for the hush money payments is set for December 4th of this year, 2023. The trial for the same case is scheduled to begin in Manhattan on March 25th of 2024. I didn't catch what the ramifications are for that indictment. It's a state case, so I'm not sure. I have not really looked too much into that one. I did spend a little time back in June. I think it was June. In June 2023, Trump was indicted by the federal government for his handling of classified documents after he left the White House, which is what we took care of the last politics stream. On July 27th, Special Counsel Jack Smith charged Trump with 3 counts, 2 of which are related to alleged attempts to delete surveillance video footage at a Mar-a-Lago resort in summer 2022. So that's like an additional thing. Like the legality of this. First of all, one quick caveat that I need to mention before I go any further. I am not a lawyer. I'll never be a lawyer. I have no intention of being a lawyer. I don't understand law. A lot of law information I get is like a amalgamation of Wikipedia and ChatGPT. I just read the things that are on the screen and react accordingly. I base my assumptions on what do you call it? On the evidence that is presented before me. So now that we have presented the facts of the case, let's go ahead and take a deep dive into the 45 pages of the third indictment, a second federal indictment of former President Donald J. Trump. So case, this one, 1, 2, 3, C, whatever, filed today in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, United States of America versus Donald J. Trump. Grand jury original violations, count 1. We'll go more over these later, but count 1 through 4. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. I don't have any idea what that means, so I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of these seem relatively self-explanatory, but I'm interested to see what the conspiracy against rights is. I guess I could ask the Council of Bots. I wasn't planning on bringing them into this, but we could ask them, like, what is What is conspiracy against rights in legal terms? Let's ask the council. I don't trust ChatGPT first. Bard, Pi. I'm gonna go to Bing. Oh, good. Bing's first reply is according to Wikipedia. Conspiracy against rights is a federal offense. It's defined in a situation where two or more people go into disguise. Okay, whatever. We'll get more information about that later. Hello, Micah. How are you today? Well, welcome to another exciting evening. We are going to go into the third indictment of the United States former President Donald Trump. So sit back, relax, have some relaxing tea. I don't know what time it is over there. It's probably godforsaken early. It is 9:06 over here in the States, or at least in God's country of Florida, which is a horrible hellhole. Indictment. The grand jury charges that, at all times material to this indictment, on or of the dates and at the approximate time stated below, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, was the 45th President of the United States and a candidate for re-election in 2020. The defendant lost the 2020 presidential election. Despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false. Editor's note, demonstrably false, like 100 times over proven they were false. Editor's note, over. And that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false, but the defendant repeatedly and widely disseminated them anyways, to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. The defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly of the election and even to claim, falsely, that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts or audits of the popular vote in states or filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures. Indeed, in many cases, the defendant did pursue these methods of contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts excuse me, I have to restate that. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges was uniformly unsuccessful. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In so doing, the defendant perpetrated this many criminal conspiracies. A conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government in violation of for every one of these violations, for every one of these statutes that comes up, just getting a bell. Just in violation of that. A conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified. The certification proceeding. In violation of that. A conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted. In violation of that. Each of these conspiracies, which built on the widespread mistrust the defendant was creating through pervasive and destabilizing lies about election fraud, targeted a bedrock function of the United States federal government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election, or the federal government function. Count 1. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, and this one I will read out. 18 United States Code, I think that's what that USC means, 371. The allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 of this indictment are realleged and fully incorporated here by reference. The conspiracy. From on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 20th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. The purpose of the conspiracy was to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the federal government function by which those results are collected, counted, and certified. To stay a king forever, more or less. Editor's note. The defendant's co-conspirators. The defendant enlisted co-conspirators to assist him in his criminal efforts to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election and retain power. Among those were co-conspirator 1, an attorney who was willing to spread knowingly false claims and pursue strategies that the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign attorneys would not. Co-conspirator 2, an attorney who devised and attempted to implement a strategy to leverage the vice president's ceremonial role, overseeing the certification proceeding to obstruct the certification of the presidential election. Co-conspirator 3, an attorney whose unfounded claims of election fraud the defendant privately acknowledged to others sounded crazy. Nonetheless, the defendant embraced and publicly amplified co-conspirator 3's disinformation. Co-conspirator 4, a Justice Department official who worked on civil matters and who, with the defendant, attempted to use the Justice Department to open sham election crime investigations and investigate state legislatures with knowingly false claims of election fraud. Co-conspirator 5, an attorney who assisted in devising and attempting to implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding. And co-conspirator 6, my golly, just a whole menagerie of co-conspirators. You always need a gang, don't you, Trumpy? A political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceedings. The federal government function. Okay, so this looks like basically a reiteration of what the federal government actually does for everybody in the audience of the grand jury and the actual court in the future who doesn't know what was supposed to actually happen on January 6th. The federal government function, by which the results of the election for President of the United States are collected, counted, and certified, was established through the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, the ECA, a federal law enacted in 1887. The Constitution provided that individuals called electors select the president, and that each state determined for itself how to appoint the electors apportioned to it. That was a horrible mistake. Whew. Through state laws, each of the 50 states in the District of Columbia choose to select their electors based on the popular vote in the state. After election day, the ECA required each state to formally determine or ascertain the electors who would represent the state's voters by casting electoral votes on behalf of the candidate who had won the popular vote, and required the executive of each state to certify to the federal government the identity of those electors. Then, on a date set by the ECA, each state's ascertained electors were required to meet and collect the results of the presidential election. That is, to cast electoral votes based on their state's popular vote and to send their electoral votes along with the state's executive certification that they were the state's legitimate electors to the United States Congress to be counted and certified in an official proceeding. Long story short, the states basically have some people that they would classify as the electors. and those people would carry their vote to Congress, basically saying, hey, guys, I represent the state of Alabama, and that state said they voted for Trump, so I want to send my however many electoral votes for Trump. And then you get California, and they're giving their votes to Biden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A horrible idea to leave this in the hands of the states, as we are about to probably see later in this indictment. Finally, the Constitution and ECA required that on the 6th of January following Election Day, the Congress meet in a joint session for a certification proceeding, presided over by the Vice President as President of the Senate to count the electoral votes, resolve any objections, and announce the results, thus certifying the winner of the presidential election as President-elect. And let me tell you, if you don't remember or you weren't in America during this time, there was a palpable tension for the weeks leading up to January 6th, because we knew there was something crazy going on. Hi, baby. What kids say hi? What have you missed? Trump did illegal things. Also, I'm not a lawyer. Basically, long story short, you didn't really miss anything. It sort of just went over what the state is supposed to do during a federal election. They send their electors to the government. They say, "Hey, I'm from California. I give my elector my votes to Biden, and Alabama gives their votes to Trump, etc." And everything's been fine, more or less, forever, as seen here. The federal government function, from the point of ascertainment to the certification, is foundational to the United States democratic process, and until 2021 had operated in a peaceful and orderly manner for more than 130 years. The thing I was mentioning earlier is that, the weeks leading up to January 6th was palpable tension. Excuse me one second. Palpable tension leading up to because they knew they would try something. Didn't expect this, but we knew they would try something. Manners and means. The defendant's co-conspirator. Let me take a drink real quick. Oh, that was delicious. The defendant's conspiracy to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function through dishonesty, fraud, and deceit. Jack Smith is done with Trump's shit. He's just you're straight up a villain. Included the following manner and means. A. The defendant and co-conspirators used knowingly false claims of electoral fraud to get state legislators and election officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change electoral votes for the defendant's opponent, Joseph R. Biden Jr. by Kitty, to electoral votes for the defendant. That is, on the pretext of baseless fraud claims, the defendant pushed officials in certain states to ignore the popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss the legitimate electors, and ultimately cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors in favor of the defendant. Bed. The defendant and co-conspirators organized fraudulent slates of electors in 7 targeted areas: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal state laws. This included causing the fraudulent electors to meet on the day appointed by federal law on which legitimate electors were to gather and cast their votes, cast fraudulent votes for the defendant, and sign certificates falsely representing that they were legitimate electors. Some fraudulent electors were tricked into participating based on their understanding that their votes would be used only if the defendant succeeded in outcome determinative lawsuits within their state, which the defendant never did. Ever. Not once. The defendant and co-conspirators caused the fraudulent electors to transmit their false certificates. What's going on? What's up? To transmit their false certificates to the vice president and other government officials to be counted at the certification. Proceeding on January 6th. C. The defendant and co-conspirators attempted to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations and to send a letter to the targeted states that falsely claimed that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election results. Pretty much, yeah. This is the Trump is going to jail paper. I'm not a lawyer, but it's not looking super friendly. That sought to advance the defendant's fraudulent elector plan by using the Justice Department's authority to falsely present the fraudulent electors as a valid alternative to the legitimate electors, and that urged on behalf of the Justice Department the targeted states' legislatures to convene and create the opportunity to choose the fraudulent electors over the legitimate electors. This is not a fart. That's not what it is. This is indictment number 3. So if the other 2 indictments don't pan out, I mean, the more the merrier. I mean, I'm trying to, present an objective view, but anybody who knows me knows I'm not objective when it comes to old Trumpy. D. The defendant and co-conspirators attempted to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results. I see Budspot has entered the room. First, using knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant and co-conspirators attempted to convince the vice president to use the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than counting them. When that failed, on the morning of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirators repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud to gathered supporters, falsely told them that the vice president had the authority to and might alter the election results, and directed them to the Capitol to obstruct the certification proceeding and exert pressure on the vice president to take the fraudulent actions he had previously refused. Woo! Okay, that was a mouthful. So he appointed new officials, which were his friends, to perform the function send paper forward. Kind of. Basically, what the special elector things is the electors they would send to the government. The thing I was talking about before, like Washington would send theirs electors, I missed the second half of that explanation. So places like, hold on, let me go back up to Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, or at least 8 states sent alternative people. They basically said, hey, all those people, Eugene V. Debs, I do not know who that is. The people in all those states I mentioned, they said, okay, you know what? We understand that our places might have voted for Biden, but we kind of think people are dumb and there was election fraud, so we're actually gonna vote for Trump instead. He ran for president in prison in the 1920s. So there's a precedent. There's a precedent. Hold on, I got something for this. That wasn't what I meant. I didn't mean a clap. That wasn't that funny. I meant for a laugh. Never mind. Oh God, we're missing. We got sidetracked. After it became public on the afternoon of January. Anyways, sorry, I forgot to explain this last thing. So long story short, the defendant, Trump, and the co-conspirators attempted to enlist Mike Pence, the vice president of the U.S., basically said, hey, VP, can you take all of the results of all the electors, even the legitimate ones, and don't use them and use mine instead, or do basically all these things, he said. And basically said, Pence, you need to do all those things that I want you to do, please. Thanks. After it became public on the afternoon of January 6th that the vice president would not fraudulently alter the election results, a large and angry crowd, including many individuals whom the defendant had deceived into believing the vice president could and might change the election results, violently attacked the Capitol and halted the proceeding. As violence ensued, the defendant and co-conspirators exploited the disruption by redoubling efforts to levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress to further delay the certification based on those claims. Basically, when it became clear that Pence wouldn't cheat, a large crowd attacked the Capitol, and January 6th happened. The violence happened, and the disruption happened, and Trump and company still repeated this bullshit lie that they knew was still a lie. I'm not a lawyer. This is not a legal statement. It's definitely bullshit, and I can say that because I am a parody speaker and not a lawyer. The defendant's knowledge of the falsity of his election fraud claims. The defendant, his co-conspirators, and their agents made knowingly false claims that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the 2020 presidential election. You think the mob scaling fences is a red herring in this legal stuff? There was a lot that happened on January 6th that I don't have answers for. What I do have answers for is that when they did go into the building, all of the bad things happened. How they got in the building, a lot of answers that I don't have, and I don't have enough knowledge to say. All I know is they shouldn't have been in the building. Just gonna leave it at that. I'm not a lawyer. These prolific lies about election fraud included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as the large number of dead, non-resident, non-citizen, or otherwise ineligible voters had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to vote for Biden. These claims were false, demonstrably, as proven many times over. And the defendant knew that they were false. In fact, the defendant was notified repeatedly that his claims were untrue, often by the people on whom he relied for candid advice on important matters, and who were best positioned to know the facts, and he deliberately disregarded the truth. For instance, the defendant's vice president, who personally stood to gain by remaining in office as part of the defendant's ticket, and whom the defendant asked to study fraud allegations, told the defendant that he had seen no evidence of outcome determinative fraud. Mike Pence had everything to gain. He had everything to gain by lying. He could have stayed vice president for the next 4 years, and the crowd probably would have let him do it. So the fact, I don't simp for Mike Pence. He's a terrible man, but on that day he did the right thing, and I don't give courtesy awards for doing your job. The senior leaders of the Justice Department, appointed by the defendant and responsible for investigating credible allegations of election crimes, told the defendant on multiple occasions that various allegations of fraud were unsupported. The Director of National Intelligence, the defendant's principal advisor on intelligence matters related to national security, disabused the defendant of the notion that the intelligence community's finding regarding foreign interference would change the outcome of the election. Basically, they called him out on his BS of the foreign interference theory. The Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, or CISA, whose existence the defendant signed into law to protect the nation's cybersecurity infrastructure from attack, joined an official multi-agency statement that there was no evidence that any voting system had been compromised, and that declared the 2020 election the most secure in American history. Days later, after the CISA director, whom the defendant had appointed, announced publicly that election security experts were in agreement that claims of computer-based election fraud were unsubstantiated, the defendant fired him. Womp, 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 womp. The Department of Homeland Security's cyberspace head guy, director, said that there was no problems with the election, and Trump fired him, which sounds like something anybody would do if you're feeling what's the word? Anything an innocent person would do is fire the person that said there was no election fraud. I'm not aware. Senior White House attorneys selected by the defendant to provide him candid advice informed the defendant that there was no evidence of outcome determinative election fraud and told him that his presidency would end on Inauguration Day in 2021. Senior staffers on the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign, or the defendant's campaign, or campaign, whose sole goal was the defendant's re-election, told the defendant on November 7, 2020 that he had only a 5 to 10% chance of prevailing in the election, and that success was contingent on the defendant winning out ongoing vote counts or litigation in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Within a week of that assessment, the defendant lost in Arizona, meaning he had lost the election. State legislatures and officials, many of whom were the defendant's political allies, had voted for him and wanted him to be reelected, repeatedly informed the defendant that his claims of fraud in their states were unsubstantiated or false and resisted his pressure to act based on them. State and federal counts, the neutral arbitrators responsible for ensuring the fair and even-handed administration of election laws, rejected every outcome-determinative post-election lawsuit filed by the defendant, his co-conspirators, his allies, providing the defendant real-time notice that his allegations were meritless. You went to court, you lost. You went to court, you lost. You went to court 60 times, and you lost. You're wrong. You're going to jail, and I'm not a lawyer. The defendant widely disseminated his false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew, and in many cases had been informed directly, that they were not true. The defendant's knowingly false claims were integral to his criminal plan. Okay, now I'm getting into comic tones here. Were integral to his criminal plans to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' rights to votes and have their votes counted. He made these knowingly false claims throughout the post-election time period, including those below that he made immediately before the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The defendant insinuated that more than 10,000 dead voters had voted in Georgia. Just 4 days earlier, Georgia's Secretary of State had explained to the defendant that this was false. The defendant asserted that there were 205,000 more votes than voters in Pennsylvania. The defendant's acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general had explained to him that this was false. The defendant said that there has been a suspicious vote dump in Detroit, Michigan. The defendant's attorney general had explained to the defendant that this was false, and the defendant's allies in the Michigan state legislature, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Majority Leader of the Senate had publicly announced that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in the states. How did you get banned? You're not banned, are you kidding?
Lay off the Asians, Lou.
You're not banned. Hi, Brain Vesta. Oh, I see.
I did everything right and they indicted me.
There you go, kitty. It accidentally timed you out for a very long time. I wouldn't do a roulette. I need to fix that. Where were we? Sorry about that. Yeah, kitty, if you get rouletted, you're out for 1,200 seconds, so I wouldn't do that. My bad. I'll fix that later. The defendant claimed that there had been tens of thousands of double votes and other fraud in Nevada. The Nevada Secretary of State had previously rebutted the defendant's fraud claims by publicly posting a Facts versus Myths document explaining that Nevada judges had reviewed and rejected them, and the Nevada Supreme Court had rendered
everything right and Roar indicted her.
and Roar indicted me, had rendered a decision denying such claims. The defendant said that more than 30,000 non-citizens had voted in Arizona. The defendant's own campaign manager had explained to him that such claims were false, and that the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, who had supported the defendant in the election, had issued a public statement that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in Arizona, and Finally, the defendant asserted that voting machines in various contested states had switched votes from the defendant to Biden. The defendant's Attorney General, Acting Attorney General, and Acting Deputy Attorney General had all explained to him. I like to imagine they were all around him at a table, and he's just sitting there petulantly with his arms wrapped around his chest like, no! An Acting Attorney General all explained to him that this was false, and numerous recounts and audits had confirmed the accuracy of voting machines. The criminal agreement and acts to effect the object of the conspiracy. The defendant's use of deceit. This seems like an old-timey novel, like a criminal mystery novel. The defendant's use of deceit to get state officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change electoral votes. Now we switch back to boring tone. This is back to normal day. Shortly after Election Day, which fell on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant launched his criminal scheme. On November 13th, the defendant's campaign attorneys conceded in court that they had lost the vote count in the state of Arizona, meaning based on the assessment the defendant's campaign advisors had given him just a week earlier, the defendant had lost the election. So the next day, the defendant turned to co-conspirator 1, who I'm just going to call 1 from now on, who he announced would spearhead his efforts going forward to challenging the election results. From that point on, the defendant and his co-conspirators executed a strategy to use knowing deceit
Do the balls go in the condom too?
in the targeted states to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function, including as described below. On November 13th, 2020, the defendant had a conversation, this is in Arizona, I guess, had a conversation with his campaign manager, who informed him that a claim had been circulating that a substantial number of non-citizens had voted in Arizona was false. On November 22nd, 8 days before Arizona's governor certified the ascertainment of the state's legitimate electors based on the popular vote, the defendant and co-conspirator 1, which I'll, back and forth between them, I guess, called the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives and made knowingly false claims of election fraud aimed at interfering with the ascertainment of and voting by Arizona's electors as follows. The defendant in 1 falsely asserted, among other things, that a substantial number of non-citizens, non-residents, and dead people Is there no better legal way of saying that? A bunch of non-citizens, non-residents, and corpses had voted fraudulently in Arizona. The Arizona House Speaker asked co-conspirator 1 for evidence of the claims, which 1 did not have, but claimed he would provide. 1 never did so. The defendant in 1 asked the Arizona House Speaker to call the legislature into session to hold a hearing based on the claims of election fraud. The Arizona House Speaker refused, stating that doing so would require a 2/3 vote of its members and he would not allow it without actual evidence of fraud. The defendant in 1 asked the Arizona House Speaker to use the legislature to circumvent the process by which legitimate electors would be ascertained for Biden based on the popular vote, and replace those electors with a new slate for the Democrats. The Arizona House Speaker refused, responding that the suggestion was beyond anything he had ever heard of or thought that was something within his authority. You think for a matter of clarity that there is no doubt you're referring to dead people and not, for example, people who passed on, which can be interpreted differently. I suppose so. I guess corpses probably isn't a good term either. On December 1st, 1 met with the Arizona House Speaker. When the Arizona House Speaker asked 1 for evidence of the outcome determinative election fraud he and the defendant had been claiming, 1 responded to words with the effects of, "We don't have the evidence, but we have a lot of theories." Where's my laugh? There it is. The deceased. Yeah, like, deceased people. I guess dead and deceased is interchangeable. I suppose. It just seems like a funny word. On December 4th, Titus laughed on the edge of a parapet. Una told him he shouldn't laugh anymore. The Arizona House Speaker issued a public statement that said, in parts, No election is perfect, and if there were evidence of illegal votes or an improper count, then Arizona law provides a process to contest the election, and a lawsuit under state law. But the law does not authorize the legislature to reverse the results of an election. Dead people. Dead! I said dead! As a conservative Republican, I don't like the results of the presidential election. I voted for President Trump and worked hard to re-elect him, but I cannot and will not ascertain or entertain a suggestion that we violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election. I and my fellow legislators swore an oath to support the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution and laws of the state of Arizona. I and it would violate that oath, the basic principles of Republican government, and the rule of law if we attempted to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud. Under the laws that we wrote and voted upon, Arizona voters choose who wins, and our system requires that their choice be respected. Do you like my Arizona accent? On the morning of January 4th, 2021, Two called the Arizona House Speaker to urge him to use a majority of the legislature to decertify the state's legitimate electors. Arizona's validly ascertained electors had voted 3 weeks earlier and sent their votes to Congress, which was scheduled to count those votes in Biden's favor in just 2 days' time at the January 6th certification proceeding. When the Arizona House Speaker explained that state investigations had uncovered no evidence of substantial fraud in the state, Two conceded that he didn't know enough about facts on the ground in Arizona, but nonetheless told the Arizona House Speaker to decertify and let the courts sort it out. So legal. I'm not a lawyer. Do I have some weird sound filters? I don't really have any. I have a voice mod, but it's not set up. The Arizona House Speaker refused, saying that he would not play with the oath he had taken to uphold the United States Constitution and Arizona law. God, I love seeing good. I love seeing Republicans that actually do their jobs.
I walk where I want.
What's it to you, buttnut? On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false claim that 36,000 non-citizens had voted in Arizona. What's the difference between dead and passed on? I assume that in a case like this, they need to look at every single word and put it through. Like, they can't put through something like passed on or euthanasia. I don't know. They got to be very specific. Some dead dudes voted is what Trump is saying. On November 16th, 2020, on the defendant's behalf, his executive assistant sent 3 and others a document containing bullet points critical of a certain voting machine company who will not be named here or anywhere. He doesn't want to get sued. Sadly, good Republicans are few and far between these days. Unfortunately, yes, and it shouldn't be that way. A lot of the country is more purple than anything else. But it's unfortunate. On November 16th, writing, see attached. Please include as is or almost as is in lawsuit. Co-conspirator 3 responded 9 minutes later, screaming in all text like a grandpa. It must go in all suits in ga and pa immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire election to be set aside in those states and machines impounded for nonpartisan professional inspection. On November 25th, 3 filed a lawsuit against the governor of Georgia, falsely alleging massive election fraud accomplished through the voting machine company's election software and hardware. Before the lawsuit was even filed, the defendant retweeted a post promoting it. The defendant did this despite the fact that when he discussed it with 3's far-fetched public claims regarding the voting machine company in private with advisors. I know that I'm bumbling a lot of these words, but this is I know it has to be super specific, but it is cumbersome to read. The defendant had conceded that they were unsupported and that 3 sounded crazy. 3's Georgia lawsuit was dismissed on December 7th. This is also legal. It is so legal. If it is anybody else, he would be in jail already. He's going to jail. I'm not a lawyer. On December 3rd, one orchestrated a presentation to the Judicial Subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate with the intention of misleading state senators into blocking the ascertainment of legitimate electors. During the presentation, an agent of the defendant and one falsely claimed that more than 10,000 dead people voted in Georgia. That afternoon, do I have a gasp for this? I do. 10,000! That afternoon, a senior advisor told the defendant's chief of staff through text messages, just an FYI, a campaign lawyer and his team verified that the 10,000 supposed dead people voting in Georgia is not accurate. It was alleged in one's hearing today. The senior advisor clarified that he would believe the actual number was 12. 12. Most of them were probably Republicans, based on history. I hate to shit on Republicans. They make it so easy. And not even Republicans, just extreme conservatives. It is mostly. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not political. Another agent of the defendant and co-conspirator one played a misleading excerpt of a video recording of ballot counting at State Farm Arena in Atlanta and insinuated that it showed election workers counting suitcases of illegal ballots. Two encouraged the legislatures to decertify the state's legitimate electors based on false allegations of election fraud. Also on December 3rd, the defendant issued a tweet amplifying the knowingly false claims made in one's presentation in Georgia. You think most important elections should be done in pen and paper, and yes, you think I'm kid will post. See, here's the thing, Micah. I agree in theory, but every election that has been, like, our elections in America are insanely secure. All of this allegation that this dumpy orange idiot is throwing out there, they're so blazingly secure. It's insane. And I'll tell you something. I don't know how much you know about American history, but the last real time that we really focused on paper ballots, we ended up with George Bush as president. So I mean, it ended up being very bad at the end of the day. The defendant issued a tweet knowingly false claims in one's presentation in Georgia. Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place in Georgia. I can't do a Trump right now, so he gets a surfer. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were fart to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win of the state. Yeah, and unfortunately it was in Florida, which is, where I'm from. Because so. Whoopee! On December 4th, the Georgia State's Security of State's Chief Operating Officer debunked the claims made by one's presentation the previous day, issuing a tweet stating, the 90-second video of election workers at State Farm Arena purporting to show fraud was watched in its entirety, hours, by Georgia Secretary of State investigators, showed normal ballot processing. Here is the fact check on that.
Florida, I'm not a state, I'm a monster.
Florida's so beautiful, though. It's so beautiful, Brainbuster. On December 7th, he reiterated during a press conference that a claim that there had been misconduct at the State Farm Arena was false. On December 8th, the defendant called the Georgia Attorney General to pressure him to support an election lawsuit filed in the Supreme Court by another state's Attorney General. The Georgia Attorney General told the defendant that officials had investigated various claims of election fraud in the state and were not seeing evidence to support him. So I'm seeing, like, this is all just piling more and more evidence, because what they're going to say eventually is, but was it illegal? And then they're going to say, well, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Also, on December 8th, a senior campaign advisor who spoke with the defendant on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were untrue, expressed frustration that many of one and his legal team's claims could not be substantiated. As early as mid-November, for instance, the senior campaign advisor had informed the defendant that his claims of a large number of dead voters in Georgia were untrue. Dead voters seemed fine that time. I'm not sure why. With respect to the persistent false claim regarding State Farm Arena on December 8th, the senior campaign advisor wrote in an email. When our research and campaign legal team can't back any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0-32 on our cases. Oh! I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. On December 10th, 4 days before Biden validly ascertained electors were scheduled to cast votes and send them to Congress, one appeared at the hearing before the Georgia's House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. One played the State Farm Arena video again and falsely claimed that it showed voter fraud right in front of people's eyes and was the tip of the iceberg. Then he cited 2 election workers by name, baselessly accused them of quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they were vials of heroin or cocaine, and suggested that they were criminals whose places of work, their homes should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud. Voter fraud! Thereafter, the 2 election workers received numerous death threats. USB drives? What did he say? USB ports? Oh, maybe. Funny thing, they also today, some judge, a Pennsylvania state judge, just ruled that Trump had presidential immunity from these death threats, which sucks. So it's like, count 1 in the point for Trump, I guess. A LAN party. A LAN party of they just brought home their hard drives and just shared voter information because that's what people do in the real world. On December 15th, can't talk today. I need a drink. 1 second. On December 15th, the defendant summoned the incoming acting attorney general, the incoming acting deputy attorney general, and others to the Oval Office to discuss allegations of election fraud. During the meeting, the Justice Department officials specifically refuted the defendant's claim about State Farm Arena, explaining to him that the activity shown on the tape one had used was benign. On December 23rd, a day after the defendant's chief of staff personally observed the signature verification process at the Cobb County Civic Center and notified the defendant that state election officials were conducting themselves in an exemplary fashion and would find fraud if it existed. The defendant tweeted that the Georgia officials administering the signature verification process were trying to hide evidence of election fraud and were terrible people. What does that mean? Was that like a typo Trump had? Terrible. In a phone call on December 27th, the defendant spoke with the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general. I remember this. I remember listening on the day this came out. This was so illegal. Excuse me. During the call, the defendant again pressed the unfounded claims regarding State Farm Arena, and the 2 top Justice Department officials again rebutted the allegations, telling him the Justice Department had reviewed videotape and interviewed witnesses and had not identified any suspicious conduct. Maybe it's not yet. I'm trying to think of when the 10,000 votes. I just need to find some votes. On December 31st, the defendant signed the verification affirming false election fraud allegations made on his behalf in a lawsuit filed in his name against the Georgia governor. In advance of the filing, Tu, who was advising the defendant on the lawsuit, acknowledged in an email that he and the defendant had, since signing a previous verification, been made of some allegations and evidence proffered by the experts had been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation with the knowledge and incorporation by reference would not be accurate. The defendant in 2 caused the defendant's signed verification to be filed nonetheless. Oh, I think this is it. On January 2nd, 4 days before Congress's certification proceedings, the defendant and others called Georgia's state's Secretary of State. During the call, the defendant lied to the Georgia Secretary of State to induce him to alter Georgia's popular vote count and call into question the validity of Biden's electors' votes, which had been transmitted to Congress weeks before, including as follows. The defendant raised allegations regarding the State Farm Arena video, which from now on I'm just going to say the Arena video, and repeatedly disparaged one of the same election workers that one had maligned on December 10th, using her name almost 20 times and falsely referring to her as a professional vote scammer and hustler. In response, the Georgia Secretary of State refuted this. You're talking about the State Farm video, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that one or his people, they sliced and diced that video and took it out of context. When the Georgia Secretary of State then offered a link to the video that would disprove one's claims, the defendant responded, I don't care about a link, I don't need it, Georgia Secretary of State, I have a much better link. The defendant asked about rumors that paper ballots cast in the election were being destroyed, and the Georgia Secretary of State counsel, who was this? This was Adam, right? Heffenberg, explained to him that the claim had been investigated and was not true. The defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia, causing the Georgia Secretary of State to respond, well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were two people that were dead and voted, and so your information's wrong. That was 2. The defendants claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots in Georgia's election, which the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel refuted, explaining, we've been going through each of those as well, and those numbers that we've got, that defendant's counsel was just saying, they're not accurate. Everyone that we've been through are people that lived in Georgia, moved back to a different state, but then moved back to Georgia legitimately. They moved back in years ago. This was not like something just before the election. In response to multiple others of the defendant's allegations, the Georgia I see it in the next paragraph. I'm getting hype. I'm getting excited. The Georgia Secretary of State's counsel told the defendant that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was examining all such claims and finding no merit to them. The defendant said that he needed to find 11,780 votes, and insinuated that the Georgia Secretary of State and his counsel would be subject to criminal prosecution if they failed to find election fraud as he demanded, stating, and you are going to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal. That's a criminal offense, and you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and the Georgia State Secretary of Counsels, your lawyer. God, this is so illegal. The next day, on January 3rd, the defendant falsely claimed that the Georgia Secretary of State had not addressed the defendant's allegations, publicly stating that the Georgia Secretary of State was unwilling to answer the questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false information and insinuation that more than 10,300 dead people had voted in Georgia. Michigan. Kitty, this one's for you. On November 5th, 2020, the defendant claimed that there'd been a suspicious ads are coming. Suspicious dump of votes. I'm going to refill my water after the ads. I don't like them any more than you do. Twitch ads on their way. Go make yourself a sandwich. If you don't like the Twitch ads, push that little subscribe button down there. I'd wink if I could. Hold on, I have something for this. There you go. Anyways, I'm going to go get a drink of water. We'll be back in about 3 minutes. See you later. Love you. I'll be back. Coming back in just a minute. Oh, I heard that. Coffee. Heads over, they are. Whew. Come back. Hello, Shadow the Vampire. I feel like I remember your name. I'm back. Hup, hup, chap. Okay, sorry about that. I have coffee now. Woo. That's so hot. Okay, cool. I'm just gonna leave that over to the side to get cold for later. Awesome. Anyway, sorry about that. Sorry about the ads. That's Twitch. Michigan. So, on November 5th, 2020, the defendant claimed that there'd been a suspicious dump of votes, purportedly illegitimate ballots, stating in Detroit there were hours of unexplained delay in delivering many of the votes for counting. The final batch did not arrive until 4 in the morning, and even though the polls closed at 8 o'clock, so they brought it in, and the batches came in, and nobody knew where they came from. On November 20th, 3 days before Michigan's governor signed a certificate of ascertainment notifying the federal government that, based on the popular vote, Biden's electors were to represent Michigan's voters, the defendant held a meeting in the Oval Office with the Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives and by the Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate. In the meeting, the defendant raised the false claim, among others, of an illegitimate vote dump in Detroit. Vote dump. Poop. In response, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader told the defendant that he had lost Michigan not because of fraud, but because the defendant had underperformed with certain voter populations in the state. Upon leaving the meeting, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader issued a statement reiterating this. The Senate and House Oversight Committees are actively engaged in a thorough review of Michigan's elections process, and we have faith in the committee's process to provide greater transparency and accountability to our citizens. We have not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of this election in Michigan, and to legislative leaders, we will follow the law and follow the normal process regarding Michigan's electors, just as we have said throughout this election. On December 1st, the defendant raised his Michigan vote dump claim with the Attorney General, who responded that what occurred in Michigan had been the normal vote counting process and there was no indication of fraud in Detroit. Despite this, the next day, the defendant made a knowingly false claim that in Michigan, at 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. Nobody knows anything about it. It's corrupt. Detroit is corrupt. I have a lot of friends in Detroit. They know it, but Detroit is totally corrupt. On December 4th, one sent a text message to the Michigan House Speaker reiterating his unsupported claim of election fraud and attempting to get the House Speaker to assist in reversing the ascertainment of the legitimate Biden electors, stating, "Looks like Georgia may hold some factual hearings and change the certification under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Everything Right and You Indicted Me." As co-conspirator 2 explained, they don't have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan. They don't just have the right to do it, but the obligation. Similarly, on December 7th, despite still having established no fraud in Michigan, co-conspirator 1 sent a text intended for the Michigan State Senate Majority Leader. So I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that states that the election is in dispute, there's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, and the electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not the official electors, this is so fucking illegal, of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadline of December 8th under Michigan law. On December 14th, the day that electors in states across the country were required to vote and submit their votes to Congress, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader announced that, contrary to the defendant's requests, they would not decertify the legitimate election results or electors in Michigan. The state Senate Majority Leader's public statement included, "We have not received evidence of fraud on a scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan." The Michigan House Speaker's public statement read, in part, "We've diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. Blech. I think he's done an incredible job. But I love our republic too. I can't fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump, simply because some think there may have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason, and that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new slate of electors. I fear we'd lose our country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College, and I can't stand for that. I won't." On January 6, 2021, the defendant publicly repeated his knowingly false claim regarding an illicit dump of more than 100,000 ballots in Detroit. So basically, He's going through all these states and saying he was told multiple times that what he's saying is wrong AF. And he still stood up on a stage on January 6th and told a crowd that they were lied to. Pennsylvania. On November 11th, 2021, the defendant publicly maligned a Philadelphia city commissioner for stating on the news that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in Philadelphia. As a result, the commissioner and his family received death threats. On November 25th, the day after the governor signed a certificate of ascertainment and thus certified to the federal governor that Biden's electors were the legitimate electors of the state, one orchestrated an event at the hotel at Gettysburg attended by state legislators. One falsely claimed that Pennsylvania had issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. In the days thereafter, a campaign staffer wrote internally that one's allegations were just wrong and there's no way to defend it. The deputy campaign manager responded, "We've been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating." On December 4th, after 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislatures issued a public statement that General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state election code and constitution, the defendant retweeted a post labeling the legislators cowards. This is the President of the United States. Do you think Trump will run again in 2024? Micah, my sweet summer child, he announced he was running for president months ago, and it's pretty widely known that he's mostly doing it at an attempt to stay out of jail. It's awful, and we hate it. Oh God. Yeah, he's running. And not only is he running, he's the Republican forerunner. And not only is he the Republican forerunner, all of the polls are pretty much deadlocked that he could beat Biden. On December 31st and January 3rd, the defendant repeatedly raised with the acting attorney general and acting attorney general deputy the allegation that in Pennsylvania there had been 205,000 more votes than voters. Each time, the Justice Department officials informed the defendant that his claim was false. On January 6, 2021, the defendant publicly repeated his knowingly false claim that there had been 205,000 more votes than voters in Pennsylvania. So it's basically, on this day this happened, on this day the defendant said something, Trump said something, the people in charge of that area said, no, you're dumb, and then on January 6th, Trump said, no, they dumb, go storm the Capitol. I'm not a lawyer. That's not exactly what he said. Wisconsin. On November 29th, 2020, a recount in Wisconsin that the defendant's campaign had petitioned and paid for did not change the election result, and in fact increased the defendant's margin of defeat. I remember that. That was funny. On December 14th, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected an election challenge by the campaign. One justice wrote, "Nothing in this case casts any legitimate doubt that the people of Wisconsin lawfully chose Vice President Biden and Senator Harris to be the next leaders of our great country." On November 21st, as the result of the state Supreme Court's decision, the Wisconsin governor, who had signed a certificate of ascertainment on November 30th, identifying Biden's electors as the state's legitimate electors, signed a certificate of final determination in which he recognized that the state Supreme Court had resolved a controversy regarding the appointment of Biden's electors, and confirmed that Biden had received the highest number of votes in the state and that his electors were the state's legitimate electors. That very same day, in response to the court decision that had prompted the Wisconsin governor to sign a certificate of final determination, the defendant, Trump, issued a tweet repeating his knowingly false claim of election fraud and demanding that the Wisconsin legislature overturn the election results that had led to the ascertainment of Biden's electors as the legitimate electors. It's just repeated over and over and over again. It's like they say you didn't win, and Trump just retweets something that said, "Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. I won." On December 27th, the defendant raised with the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general a specific fraud claim that there had been more votes than voters in Wisconsin. The acting deputy attorney general informed the defendant that the claim was false. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated knowingly false claims that there had been tens of thousands of unlawful votes in Wisconsin. The defendant's use of dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to organize fraudulent slates of electors and cause them to transmit false certificates to Congress. I'm going to take a swig of coffee before I drink this. Oh, that's bad. As the defendant's attempts to obstruct the electoral vote through deceit of slate officials met with repeated failure beginning in early December 2020, he and co-conspirators developed a new plan to marshal individuals who would have served as the defendant's electors had he won the popular vote in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and sent those individuals to make and send to the Vice President and Congress false certification that these were the legitimate electors. Under the plan, the submission of the false slates would create a fake controversy at the certification proceedings and position the Vice President, presiding on January 6th as President of the Senate, to supplant legitimate electors with the defendant's fake electors and certify the defendant as President. Long story short, the electors that we were talking about earlier, they're going to send fake ones, and Vice President Pence, who would stand to gain a lot by doing this, would take those electors instead and stay President Emperor in temperate forever. The plan capitalized on ideas presented in memoranda drafted by Five, an attorney who was assisting the defendant's campaign with legal efforts relating in a recount in Wisconsin. The memoranda evolved over time from a legal strategy to preserve the defendant's rights to a corrupt plan to subvert the federal government function by stopping Biden's electors' votes from being counted and certified as follows. The November 18th memorandum, the Wisconsin memo, advocated that because of the ongoing recount in Wisconsin, the defendant's electors there should meet and cast votes on December 14th, the day the ECA required appointed electors to vote, to preserve the alternative of the defendant's Wisconsin elector slate in the event the defendant ultimately prevailed in the state. The December 6th memorandum, the fraudulent electors memo, marked a sharp departure from Five's Wisconsin memo, advocating that the alternate electors originally conceived of to preserve rights in Wisconsin instead be used in a number of states as fraudulent electors to prevent Biden from receiving the 270 electoral votes necessary to secure the presidency on January 6th. The fraudulent elector memo suggested that the defendant's electors in 6 purported contested states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, should meet and mimic as best as possible the actions of the legitimate Biden electors, and that on January 6th, the vice president should open and count the fraudulent votes, setting up a fake controversy that would derail the proper certification of Biden as president-elect. If Pence had done this, it would have been a disaster. The December 9th memorandum, the fraudulent elector instructions, consisted of Five's instructions on how fraudulent electors could mimic legitimate electors in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, who from now on I'm going to call the Glorious Six. Five noted that in some states it would be virtually impossible for the fraudulent electors to successfully take the same steps as the legitimate electors because state law required formal participation in the process by state officials or access to official resources. It is like a Benny Hill sketch, and it's so it's stupid. It's like, I hate it. It was so stressful at the time. It still is. I mean, it's not, but it was at the time. It is for some people. The plan began in early December, and ultimately the conspirators in the defendant's campaign took the Wisconsin memo and expanded it to any state the defendant claimed was contested, even New Mexico, which the defendant had lost by more than 10% of the popular vote. This expansion was forecast by emails the defendant's chief of staff sent on December 6th, forwarding the Wisconsin memo to campaign staff and writing, "We just need to have someone coordinating the electors for states." On December 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 2 called the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee. I know her. Oh, God, who is that? That's Rhonda McDaniel, isn't it? Rhonda McDaniel? Is it Rhonda McDaniel? I think that's her name. To ensure that the plan was in motion. During the call, 2 told the chairwoman that it was important for the RNC to help the defendant's campaign gather electors in targeted states, and falsely represented to her that the electors' votes would be used only if ongoing litigation in one of the states changed the results in the defendant's favor. All three at once, just like boop 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 boop. After the RNC chairwoman consulted, the RNC chairwoman consulted the campaign and heard that work on gathering electors was underway, she called and reported this information to the defendant, who responded approvingly. On December 7th, 1 received the Wisconsin memo and fraudulent elector memo. 1 spoke with 6, we haven't seen 6 yet, regarding attorneys who could assist in the fraudulent election effort of the targeted states, and he received from 6 an email identifying attorneys in the glorious 6 states. And the next day, on December 8th, 5 called the Arizona attorney on co-conspirator 6 lists. In an email after the call, the Arizona attorney recounted his conversation with 5 as follows. I just talked to the gentleman who did that memo, 5. His idea is basically all of us, the glorious 6, have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law because they're not signed by the governor, so that members of Congress can fight about whether they can be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they're not bound by federal law because they're Congress and make law, etc. Kind of wild and creative, I'm happy to discuss. My comment to him was that I'm just, I guess there's no harm in it, legally, I guess. Narrator, there was harm in it. Where was I? We would just be sending in fake electoral votes to Pence so that someone in Congress can make an objection when they start counting votes and start arguing that the fake votes should be counted. At 1's direction, on December 10th, Obama sent to points of contact in all targeted states except Wisconsin, which has already received his memos, and New Mexico a streamlined version of the Wisconsin memo, which did not reveal the intended fraudulent use of the defendant's electors, and the fraudulent electors' instructions along with fraudulent elector certificates that he had drafted. The next day, I'm giving them only as much leeway as I can morally allow. It's like I'm trying to be even the slightest bit objective of, goddamn, at least they just did their job. And that's just the most I can hope for these days. The next day, and I'm not forgiving them. I'm just saying at least just once, they did the right thing. I'll say that much. The next day, on December 11th, through 5, 1 suggested that Arizona lawyer file a petition for certiorari certificate at the Supreme Court as a pretext to claim that litigation, I'm just going to do the kid thing where I just pick my own word when I can't pronounce it, to provide cover for the convening and voting of the defendant's fraudulent electors there. 5 explained that 1 had heard from the state official and state provisional elector that it could appear treasonous. That's bolded. That's like the first word I've seen bolded in a long time. It could appear treasonous for the Arizona electors to vote on Monday if there's no pending court proceeding. To manage the plan in Pennsylvania, on December 12th, 1, 5, and 6 participated in a conference call organized by the defendant's campaign with the defendant's electors in that state. When the defendant's electors expressed concern about signing certificates representing themselves as legitimate electors, 1 falsely assured them that their certificates would only be used if the defendant succeeded in litigation. That seems fair to the electors. Not, still bad, but subsequently, 6 circulated proposed conditional language to the effect of potential inclusion in the fraudulent elector certificates. A campaign official cautioned not to offer the conditional language to other states because the other states are signing what he prepared. If it gets out, we change the language for PA, it could snowball. In some cases, the defendant's electors refuse to participate in the plan. Thank God. At least there's like, every now and then you get some people who are just like, no, I'm not doing that illegal thing. I want Trump as much as the next person, but I ain't going to jail. What's he going to do for me? I need coffee. On December 13th, co-conspirator 5 sent 1 an email memorandum that further confirmed the conspirators' plan was not to use the fraudulent electors, only in the circumstance that the defendant's litigation was successful in one of the targeted states. Instead, the plan was to falsely present the fraudulent slates as they keep using slates and states, so they keep switching back and forth, it seems like. Present the fraudulent slates as an alternative to the legitimate slates at Congress's certification proceedings. I know that they're different words, but they keep using slates and states like every 5 words. On December 13th, the defendant asked the senior campaign advisor for an update on what was going on with the elector plan and directed him to put out a statement on electors. As a result, Conspirator 1 directed the senior campaign advisor to join a conference call with him, 6, and others. When the senior campaign advisor related these developments in text messages to the deputy campaign manager, a senior advisor to the defendant, and a campaign staffer, the campaign manager responded, "Here's the thing, the way this has morphed, it's a crazy play, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it." The senior advisor wrote, "Certifying illegal votes." In turn, the participants in the group text message refused to have a statement regarding electors attributed to their names because none of them could stand by it. Thank God. Fuck. The bare minimum. Good work. Also on December 13th, at a campaign staffer's request, 5 drafted and sent fraudulent elector certificates for the defendant's electors in New Mexico, which had not previously been among the targeted states, and where there was no pending litigation on the defendant's behalf. The next day, the defendant's campaign filed an election challenge suit in New Mexico at 11:54 a.m., 6 minutes before the noon deadline for the electors' votes, as a pretext so that there was pending litigation there at the time the fraudulent electors voted. So stupid. On December 14th, the legitimate electors of all 50 states in the District of Columbia met on the respective jurisdictions to formally cast their vote for president, resulting in a total of 232 votes for the defendant and 306 for Biden. The legitimate electoral votes that Biden won in states the defendant targeted and the defendant's margin of defeat were as follows. 11, I'm not going to read this out. You can see this on the screen. 11 won by this, Georgia won by this, Michigan won by... who cares? Basically, the defendant lost by a lot. And not even that much, actually. Like, 11,000 in Georgia. Not that much. 10,000 in Arizona. On the same day, at the direction of the defendant and 1, fraudulent electors convened sham proceedings in the 7 targeted states to cast fraudulent electoral ballots in favor of the defendant. In some states, in order to satisfy legal requirements set forth for legitimate electors under state law, state officials were enlisted to provide the fraudulent electors access to state capitol buildings so that they could gather and vote there. In many cases, however, as 5 had predicted in the fraudulent elector instructions, the fraudulent electors were unable to satisfy the legal requirements. Last thing you heard about Georgia was the case of the brain-eating amoeba. Yeah, it's the case of Donald Trump. The brain-eating amoeba, yeah, it happens a lot in Florida, unfortunately, which, Trump happens to live in. So let's see if they find some in Mar-a-Lago. Nevertheless, as directed in the fraudulent elector instructions, shortly after the fraudulent electors met on December 14th, the targeted states' fraudulent elector certificates were mailed to the President of the Senate, the Archivist of the United States, and others. The defendant and co-conspirators ultimately used the certificates of the fraudulent electors to deceitfully target the government function, and to do so, and did so, contrary to how fraudulent electors were told they would be used. Yeah, the brain-eating amoeba, that's why I tried to swim in, just normal water that's treated. Unlike those of the fraudulent electors, consistent with the ECA, the legitimate electors' signed certificates were annexed to the state executive certificates of ascertainment before being sent to the President of the Senate and others. God, you live in a desert, not a swamp. The swamp... I live in the swamp, unfortunately. It's not great. At least we have AC. That evening at 6:26, the RNC chairwoman forwarded to the defendant through his executive assistant an email titled Electors Recap Final, which represented that in 6 contestant states, the Glorious Six, the defendant's electors had voted in parallel to Biden's electors. The defendant's executive assistant responded, "It's in front of him." The defendant's attempt to leverage the Justice Department to use deceit to get state officials to replace legitimate electors and electoral votes with the defendants. In late December 2020, the defendants attempted to use the Justice Department to make knowingly false claims of election fraud to officials in the targeted states through a formal letter under the acting Attorney General's signature, thus giving the defendants' lies the backing of the federal government and attempting to improperly influence the targeted states to replace legitimate Biden electors with the defendants. Your AC thermostat? Oh, that sucks. Yeah, RC kind of works. We disconnected a pipe and it works, so we got that going for us. On December 22nd, the defendant met with 4 at the White House. This was what was so scary about this. It's like, this is the White House, the federal government telling states that it's like, you gotta lie for the president. You gotta lie for Trump. Trump's gotta win. On December 22nd, the defendant met with 4 at the White House. 4 had not informed his leadership at the Justice Department of the meeting, which was a violation of the Justice Department's written policy restricting contacts with the White House to guard against improper political influence. Yeah, that's pretty telling. They shouldn't meet together. On December 26th, 4 spoke on the phone with the acting Attorney General and lied about the circumstances of the meeting with the defendant at the White House, falsely claiming that the meeting had been unplanned. The acting Attorney General directed co-conspirator 4 not to have unauthorized contacts with the White House again, and 4 said he would not. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to talk to the president. My bad." It's like, are these people stupid? The next morning, on December 27th, contrary to the acting Attorney General's direction, co-conspirator 4 spoke with the defendant again on the defendant's cell phone for nearly 3 minutes. Stop calling Trump! That afternoon, the defendant called the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General and said, among other things, "People tell me 4 is great. I should put him in." The defendant also raised multiple false claims of election fraud, which the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General refuted. When the acting Attorney General told the defendant that the Justice Department could not and would not change the outcome of the election, the defendant responded, "Just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." This is, God, so damning. So damning. On December 28th, 4 sent a draft letter to the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General, which he proposed they all sign. The draft was addressed to state officials in Georgia, and 4 proposed sending versions of the letter to elected officials in other targeted states. The proposed letter contained numerous knowingly false claims about the election in the Justice Department, including that A. The Justice Department had identified significant concerns that they may have impacted the outcome of the election in the multiple states. B. The Justice Department believed that in Georgia and other states, 2 valid slates of electors had gathered at the proper location on December 14th and that both sets of ballots had been transmitted to Congress. That is, 4's letter sought to advance the defendant's fraudulent elector plan by using the authority of the Justice Department to falsely present the fraudulent electors as a valid alternative to the legitimate electors. Just get rid of the electoral system. It's so terrible. The Justice Department urged that the state legislature convene a special legislative session to create an opportunity to, among other things, choose the fraudulent electors over the illegitimate electors. The acting Attorney Deputy General promptly responded to 4 by email and told him that his proposed letter was false, writing, "Despite dramatic claims to the contrary, we've not seen the type of fraud that calls into question the reported and certified results of the election." In a meeting shortly thereafter, I'm going to call these 2 guys, the acting Attorney General and the acting Deputy Attorney General, I'm going to call them guys. In a meeting shortly thereafter, them guys are again directed 4 not to have unauthorized contact with the White House. "I'm sorry, I won't talk to Trump again." On December 31st, the defendant summoned to the Oval Office them guys and other advisors. In the meeting, the defendant again raised claims about election fraud that Justice Department officials had already told him were untrue, and that the senior Department Justice officials reiterated were false, and suggested he might change the leadership in the Justice Department. If you don't tell me it's false, I'll just fire you with somebody who does tell me it's true. On January 2nd, 2021, just 4 days before the certification proceeding, Four tried to coerce the them guys to sign and send Four's draft letter, which contained false statements to state officials. He told them that the defendant was considering making Four the new acting attorney general, but that Four would decline the defendant's offer if them guys would agree to send the proposed letter to the targeted states. The Justice Department officials refused. Piss off. The next morning, on January 3rd, despite having uncovered no additional evidence of election fraud, Four sent to the Justice Department colleague an edited version of his draft letter to the states, which included a change from its previous claim that the Justice Department had concerns to a stronger false claim that, as of today, there is evidence of significant irregularities that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states. Just bald-faced lying. I'm not a lawyer. Also, on the morning of January 3rd, Four met with the defendant in the White House, again without having informed his bosses, and accepted the defendant's offer that he become acting attorney general. On the afternoon of January 3rd, Four spoke with a deputy White House counsel. So basically, this guy met with Trump a bunch of times. His bosses told him to stop doing that, and Trump basically said, "I'm just going to make you the boss." So illegal. The previous month, the deputy White House counsel had informed the defendant that there is no world, no option in which you do not leave the White House on January 20th. Now, the same deputy White House counsel tried to dissuade Four of assuming the role of acting attorney general. The deputy White House counsel reiterated to Four that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, and that if the defendant remained in office nonetheless, there would be riots in every major city in the United States. Four responded, "Well, the deputy White House counsel, that's why there's an Insurrection Act." Illegal. Also that afternoon, Four met with them guys, or half of them, and Four met with the acting attorney general and told him that the defendant had decided to put Four in charge of the Justice Department. The acting attorney general responded that he would not accept being fired by a subordinate and immediately scheduled a meeting with the defendant for that evening. On the evening of January 3rd, the defendant met for a briefing on an overseas national security issue with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior national security advisors. The chairman briefed the defendant on the issue, which had previously arisen in December, as well as possible ways the defendant could handle it. When the chairman and another advisor recommended that the defendant take no action because inauguration was only 17 days away and any course of action would trigger something unhelpful, the defendant calmly agreed, stating, "Yeah, you're too right. It's too late for us. We're going to give that to the next guy." The defendant moved immediately from this national security briefing to the meeting that the acting attorney general had requested earlier that day, which included Four, the acting attorney general, them guys, the Justice Department's assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel, the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, and a senior advisor. At the meeting, the defendant expressed frustration with the acting attorney general for failing to do anything to overturn the election results, and the group discussed Four's plan to investigate purported election fraud and to send his proposed letter to state officials, a copy of which was provided to the defendant during the meeting. Is Four Chris Miller? I feel like Four might be Christopher Miller. The defendant relented in his plan to replace the acting attorney general with Four only when he was told that it would result in mass resignations at the Justice Department and his own White House counsel. Oh no, that was oh god, who was that? Was it Jason Miller? No. It might have been Trump Jr. It was somebody really bad idea that he would put them in place. I don't remember who, though. At the meeting in the Oval Office on the night of January 3rd, co-conspirator Four suggested that the Justice Department should opine that the vice president could exceed his lawful authority. Jeffrey Clark. I don't remember who Jeffrey Clark is. When the Assistant Attorney General could exceed his lawful authority during the certification proceeding and change the election outcome. When the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel began to explain why the Justice Department should not do so, the defendant said, "No one here should be talking to the Vice President. I'm talking to the Vice President," and ended the discussion. Bush appointee, turbo conservative shithead. Gotcha. The defendant's attempts to enlist the Vice President to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceedings. As the January 6th congressional certification proceeding approached and other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function failed, the defendant sought to enlist the Vice President to use his ceremonial role at the certification to fraudulently alter the election results. The defendant did this first by knowingly using false claims of election fraud to convince the Vice President to accept the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than count them. When that failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C. to pressure the Vice President to fraudulently alter the election results. On December 19th, 2020, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington on the day of the certification proceeding, tweeting, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. It will be wild." So legal. Throughout late December, he repeatedly urged his supporters to come to Washington on January 6th. On December 23rd, the defendant retweeted a memo titled Operation Pence Card, which falsely asserted that the Vice President could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from the 6 targeted states. On the same day, Two circulated a 2-page memorandum outlining a plan for the President to unlawfully declare the defendant the certified winner of the presidential election. In a memorandum, the co-conspirator 2 claimed that 7 states had transmitted 2 slates of electors and proposed that the Vice President announce that Pence card. Yeah, it's huge jokes. Because of the ongoing disputes in 7 states, there are no electors that could be deemed validly appointed in those states. Next, 2 proposed steps that he acknowledged violated the ECA, advocated that, in the end, Pence then gavels President Trump as reelected. Trump card, Pence card. It's like they're a bunch of cards. Hold on, let me do this again. There's just a couple of cards. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11th, Two had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided the Vice President discretion in the counting of electoral votes, or permitted him to make the determination on his own. On several private phone calls in late December and early January, the defendant repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud, and directly pressured the Vice President to use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding on January 6th to fraudulently overturn the results of the election, and the Vice President resisted, including on December 25th, when the Vice President called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas. The defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th and his request that the Vice President reject electoral votes that day. The Vice President pushed back, telling the defendant, as the Vice President already has in previous conversations, "You know I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome." On December 29th, as reflected in the Vice President's contemporaneous notes, the defendant falsely told the Vice President that the Justice Department was finding major infractions. On January 1st, the defendant called the Vice President and berated him because he'd learned that the Vice President had opposed a lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that, at the certification, the Vice President had the authority to reject or return votes to the states under the Constitution. The Vice President responded that he thought there were no constitutional basis for such an authority and that it was improper. In response, the defendant told the Vice President, "You're too honest." Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceeding, tweeting, "The big rally protest in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal. On January 3rd, the defendant again told the vice president that at the certification proceeding, the vice president had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The vice president responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected the lawsuits making the claim the previous day. On January 3rd, two circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the ECA, the vice president would send the electoral slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count. On January 4th, the defendant held a meeting with the vice president's chief of staff, and the vice president's counsel for the purpose of convincing the vice president, based on the defendant's knowingly false claims of election fraud, that the vice president should reject or send the state's that the vice president should reject or send to the states Biden's legitimate electoral votes rather than count them. The defendant deliberately excluded his White House counsel from the meeting because the White House counsel previously had pushed back on the defendant's false claim of election fraud. During the meeting, as reflected in the vice president's notes, the defendant knowingly made false claims of election fraud, including, "Bottom line, won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes," and "We won every state," and asked, regarding a claim his senior Justice Department officials previously had told him were false, including as recently as the night before, "What about 205,000 votes more in PA than voters?" The defendant, too, then asked the vice president to either unilaterally reject the legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states or send the question of which slate was legitimate to the targeted states' legislatures. When the vice president challenged on whether the proposal to return the states was defensible, responded, "Well, nobody's tested it before." The vice president then told the defendant, "Did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying that I have the authority." The defendant responded, "That's okay. I prefer the other suggestion," of the vice president rejecting the electors unilaterally. Of course he did. Also on January 4th, when the co-conspirator 2 acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told 2, "You're going to cause riots in the streets." Nobody listens to anybody these days. 2 responded that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. After that conversation, the senior advisor notified the defendant that 2 had conceded that his plan was not going to work. It's hindsight. On the morning of January 5th, at the defendant's direction, the vice president's chief of staff and the vice president's counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. 2 now advocated that the vice president do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before, unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. During the meeting, co-conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the vice president's counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of the proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. The vice president's counsel expressed to 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. They tried. That same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6th, and he set the false expectation that the vice president had the authority to and might use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweets. At 11:06, the vice president had the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was within 40 minutes of the defendant's earlier reminder, "See you in D.C." At 5:05 p.m., Washington is being inundated with people who don't want to see an election victory stolen. Our country has had enough. They won't take it anymore. We hear you and love you from the Oval Office. At 5:43 p.m., I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Big crowds. Also on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the vice president. When the vice president refused to agree with the defendant's request that he obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the vice president that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him. Upon learning of this, the vice president's chief of staff was concerned for the vice president's safety and alerted the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail. Your boss is going to kill you, is what she told the Secret Service vice president. As crowds began to gather in Washington and were audible from the Oval Office, the defendant remarked to advisors that the crowd the following day on January 6 was going to be angry. That night, the defendant approved and caused the defendant's campaign to issue a public statement the defendant knew from his meeting with the vice president only hours before were false. The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. On January 6th, starting in the early morning hours, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the vice president to fraudulently alter the election outcome and raised publicly the false expectation that the vice president may do so. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." At 8:17 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated, "States want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt processes never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage." On the morning of January 6th, an agent of the defendant contacted a United States Senator to ask him to hand-deliver documents to the vice president. The agent then facilitated the receipt by the senator's staff of the fraudulent certificate signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which were believed not to have been delivered to the vice president or archivist by mail. When one of the senator's staffers contacted a staffer for the vice president by text message to arrange the delivery of what the senator's staff had been told were alternate slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin, because archivists didn't receive them, the vice president's staffer rejected them. Take that shit back. At 11:15 a.m., the defendant called the vice president and again pressured him to fraudulently reject or return the Biden's legitimate electoral votes. The vice president again refused. Immediately after the call, the defendant decided to single out the vice president in public marks he would make within the hour, reinserting language that he had personally drafted earlier that morning, falsely claiming that the vice president had the authority to send electoral votes to the states, but that advisors had previously successfully advocated be removed. They tried. Earlier that morning, the defendant had selected two to join one in giving public remarks before his own. When they did, well, that would easily say who 1 and 2 were. When they did so, based on knowingly false election fraud claims, 1 and 2 intensified pressure on the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification proceedings. 1 told the crowd that the vice president could cast DCA aside and unilaterally decide on the validity of these crooked ballots. He also lied when he claimed to have letters from 5 legislatures begging us to send elector slates to the legislatures for review and called for trial by combat. Wasn't that Rudy? I think that was Rudy who said trial by combat. So was that 1? 2 told the crowd, we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon is at 1 o'clock as he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we can get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of the government or not. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question. Next, beginning at 11:56, the defendant made multiple knowingly false statements integral to his criminal plans to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' right to vote and have their votes counted. The defendant repeated false claims of election fraud, gave false hope that the vice president might change the election outcome, and directed the crowd in front of him to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. The defendant's knowingly false statements for these purposes included The defendant falsely claimed that based on fraud, the vice president could alter the outcome of the election results, stating, "I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so, because if Mike does the right thing, we win this election. All he has to do, all this is from the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers in the country. He has the absolute right to do it. We're supposed to protect our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people." It's a fraudster. After the defendant falsely stated that the Pennsylvania legislature wanted to recertify their votes, they want to recertify, but the only way that happens if Mike Pence agrees to send it back, the crowd began to shout, "Send it back." The defendant also said that regular rules no longer applied, stating, "And fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules." Finally, after exhorting that we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, the defendant directed the people in front of him to go to the Capitol, suggested he was going with them, he didn't, and told them to give members of Congress the kind of pride and boldness they need to take back our country. During and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched towards the Capitol. The defendant's exploitation of violence and chaos at the Capitol. Coffee. Shortly after 1 p.m., the Vice President issued a public statement explaining that his role of the President of the Senate at the certification proceeding that was about to begin did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral vote should be counted and which should not. God, bless Pence for doing his job. Before the defendant had finished speaking, a crowd began to gather at the Capitol. Thereafter, a mass of people, including individuals who had traveled to Washington and the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through barriers cordoning the Capitol grounds and advanced on the buildings, included by violently attacking law enforcement officers trying to secure it. The defendant, who had returned to the White House after concluding his remarks, watched events at the Capitol unfold on the television in the dining room next to the Oval Office. At 2:13 p.m., after more than an hour of steady, violent advancement, the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building. After hearing news that individuals had breached the Capitol, the defendant advisors told him that there was a riot there and rioters had breached the building. When advisors urged the defendant to issue a calming message aimed at the rioters, the defendant refused, repeatedly remarking that the people at the Capitol were angry because the election had been stolen. At 2:24 p.m., after advisors had left the defendant alone in the dining room, the defendant issued a tweet intended to further delay and obstruct the certification. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what must be done to protect our country and the Constitution, giving states a chance to recertify the corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones they were asked to previously decertify. USA demands the truth. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the United States Secret Service was forced to evacuate the vice president to a secure location. At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence! Where is Pence? Bring him out!" and "Traitor Pence!" The defendant repeatedly refused to approve a message directing rioters to leave the Capitol, as it urged by his most senior advisors, including the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, the chief of staff, a deputy chief of staff, and a senior advisor. Instead, the defendant issued 2 tweets that did not ask the rioters to leave the Capitol, but instead falsely suggested that the crowd at the Capitol was being peaceful, including, at 2:38, "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They're truly on our side of the country. Stay peaceful." At 3:13 p.m., "I'm asking for everyone at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and the great men and women in blue. Thank you." Yeah, you bashed their head in with a fire extinguisher. You and your people did. At 3 p.m., the defendant had a phone call with the minority leader of the United States House of Representatives. The defendant told the minority leader that the crowd at the Capitol was more upset about the election than the minority leader was. At 4:17 p.m., the defendant released a video message on Twitter that he had just taped in the White House Rose Garden. In it, the defendant repeated the knowingly false claim that we had an election that was stolen from us, and finally asked individuals to leave the Capitol while telling them that they were very special and that we love you. After the 417 tweet, as the defendant joined others in the outer Oval Office to watch the attack of the Capitol on television, the defendant said, "See, this is what happens when they try to steal an election. These people are angry. These people are really angry about it. It's what happens." At 6:01, the defendant tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from the great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." Oh, we will. On the evening of January 6th, the defendant and one attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to convince them, based on knowingly false claims of election fraud, to delay the certification, including the defendant, through White House aides, attempted to reach 2 United States senators at 6 p.m. From 6:59 to 7:18, one placed calls to 5 United States senators and 1 United States representative. 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for 6 United States senators, whom the defendant had directed one to call and attempted to enlist them in further delaying the certification. In one of the calls, one left a voicemail intended for a senator that said, "We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues that we get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow." In another message intended for another senator, one repeated knowingly false allegations of election fraud, including that the vote counts certified by the states to Congress were incorrect, and that the governors who had certified knew that they were incorrect, that illegal immigrants had voted in substantial numbers in Arizona, and that Georgia gave you a number in which 65,000 people who were underage voted. One also claimed that the vice president's actions had been surprising and asked the senator to object to every state and kind of spread this out like a little bit of a filibuster. At 7:01, while one was calling United States senators on behalf of the defendant, the White House counsel called on the defendant to ask him to withdraw any objections and allow the certification. The defendant refused. What do you know? The attack on the Capitol obstructed and delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours until the Senate and House representatives came back into session separately at 8:06 and 9:02 respectively, and came together at a joint session at 11:35. At 11:44 p.m., co-conspirator 2 emailed the Vice President's counsel advocating that the Vice President violate the law and seek further delay of the Constitution. Co-conspirator 2 wrote, "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to allow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here." Didn't work. At 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, as President of the Senate, the Vice President announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. The defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to affect the object of the conspiracy alleged above in the above paragraphs, in violation of Title 8 United States Code, Section 371. That was all one count. There's only 2 pages left, so these are quick. Count 2. I'm hoping to get there before the next ads play. These allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are re-alleged and fully incorporated here by reference. From on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 7th, 2021, the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with conspirators, known and unknown to the general grand jury, to corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral vote in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 115C2. Count 3. Obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. The allegations are contained above, blah, 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 blah. From on or about those dates mentioned above, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, attempted to and did corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral vote in violation of the above-mentioned United States Code. Finally, count 4. Final page. Conspiracy against rights, which I was wondering about earlier. The allegations incorporated above are fully incorporated here. From on or about the dates mentioned above, Donald J. Trump did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and known to the grand jury to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate one or more people in the free exercise and enjoyment of a right and privilege secured to them by the Constitution and laws of the United States, that is, the right to vote and the right to have one's votes counted. Oh, this last one. I don't know, this last one's not going to fly. I would love it if it did, but there's no way that last one's going to be. He's going to wiggle his way out of that one. No fooling. But you know what? Other than that, I'm not going to lie. I think there's a lot of potential here, but there's definitely not the smoking gun of the other cases. I think this one, while I agree with everything, it relies on a lot of conjecture. But that said, I am not a lawyer, and I am not the one who has to figure all this out. I'm the one who I think I'm going to call it there and make myself a nice cup of kicks. Because by golly, we did it. We did another Trump indictment. Hopefully, there will be more. Just as many indictments as possible, in my opinion. The more, the merrier. But that, I think, is going to have to wait for Jack Smith. And more importantly, it's going to have to wait for another night. Because I'm going to bed. Thanks for hanging out, guys. Thanks for listening to this chill evening. Tomorrow, or whenever I stream next, we will finish up Boyfriend Dungeon, and then we will probably do another game. See you later, Micah, and see you later, everybody else. I will see you all later. Bye.
Thanks for your time. Have a good day.